千里之行，始于足下。A journey of 1,000 miles begins beneath the feet. We now gather in the Tao to travel the journey together. Welcome to Tao Talks with Derek Lin, where we take a deep dive into the Tao Te Ching by Lao Tzu. As always, I would like to extend a warm welcome to one and all. Thank you for joining us. I would like to invite you to center your thoughts and direct your attention to this moment in time, to the here and now, to be fully present and mindfully aware as we all ready ourselves for this sacred process in the Tao with one another. As we talked about last time, the chapter title for 78 is the virtue of water. 水德章. 3 characters. The leftmost character, 水, that is the character for water. The middle character, 德, that's the character for virtue. And then the third character, the one on the right, 章 is chapter. So literally, it says water virtue chapter. So the translation for that is the virtue of water. And together, this is the virtue of water chapter. Let's take a look at the chapter itself. We have 13 lines. And we did the sectional analysis last time, so we divided it up into 3 sections. As you can see here, with all the repetitions marked in red. So there are 2 lines in the second section that start that off, and it allows us to identify the division between section 1 and section 2. And chapter 78, in the introductory section, it starts with water. Talks about water being soft, being weak, or perceived as such. And yet, line 2 and line 3, it is actually strong. It is actually powerful. It is even more powerful than what we perceive as the hard and strong. Nothing can replace it. Water is supreme. It is unique. It is special. And that's why it is the fitting metaphor for the Tao. In the middle section, it's talking about how, well, everybody knows this. Everybody knows about water. We see water all the time. And yet, we cannot put the principle behind the power of water into daily practice. And there's a reason for that. And then in the concluding section, this is the most important of all. The sages will talk about accepting humiliation and misfortune. So we're going to get into all of that today. Now, I want to also recap the discussion that we had about the softness of water. If you guys recall from before, I talked about how this is one of the most reiterated concepts in the Tao Te Ching. And we went through a bunch of chapters where the concept of softness is directly addressed by Lao Tzu. And there's chapter 36, where it specifically says the soft and weak overcomes the tough and strong. And in 43, it talks about how the softer things in the world override the harder things of the world. So this is already a reiteration of 36. And then in 52, it says holding on to the soft is called strength. So this is pointing out, again, the dichotomy between softness, weakness that is perceived, versus the strength that is the reality. Then, chapter 76, only a couple of chapters ago, it says the big and forceful, in other words, the hard and strong, actually occupy a lowly position, even though in the conventional thinking, the tough and strong is seen to have a higher position. In the Tao, it's actually lower, while the soft and pliant is actually a higher place, and that's because being soft, being pliant, means being alive, capable of change, capable of growth, capable of improvement. And then finally, in the chapter we discussed today, it starts out with, well, nothing is softer than water, nothing is weaker, and yet nothing is better at overcoming the hard and strong. You can see this is a reiteration of everything that we have talked about so far. So specifically, when we discuss water, we talked about it in the context of the 5 elements, 五行. So we talked about water being one of the 5. And this diagram shows generating interactions, overcoming interactions. Out of the bunch, water may seem to be the weakest, as Lao Tzu talks about, but is actually the strongest. Then we went into the reasons why we would think that. Compared to the other elements in the 5, water has a way to overcome each one of them. And it is the very nature of water to overcome them. So when we take a step back and look at 五行 from a higher perspective, we note that water is able to corrode metal. Water can disintegrate wood, and water certainly can extinguish fire. We see that all the time. And we have seen, just by looking at nature, the Grand Canyon, the various cliffs, the rivers, as water flows across the land, it is able to carve out and sculpt terrain. It is cutting into rocks. It can seep into and dissolve dirt, clay, rocks, etc. Manifestations of the earth element. Then that allows us to point to all these different kinds of interactions to say that water seems to be weak, but is actually very strong. Then we can also look at it from a different angle and say that no matter what it is, everything in the world, water can flood, inundate, or cover it up. Water has the nature to be able to contain all things, to flood all things. Water gets everywhere. Water flows to and occupies the lowest point. That is the virtue of humility. No matter where we happen to be, any water in that vicinity will naturally flow to the lowest point in that vicinity. So that is a metaphor that we use to talk about being humble, occupying the lowest point. And then for everyone, well, water treats everyone exactly the same. There's no favoritism. Water is going to float all boats or sink all boats the same way, no matter how big or small. So this is the ultimate egalitarianism. Water makes no difference to water, whether someone is rich or poor, tall or short, powerful or weak. Water will treat that person exactly the same, will slake the thirst or drown that person. It's life and death, but it's applied equally. And we also talk about water seeks its own level, high tide floats all boats, etc. So all of these are different ways to look at water, how the soft and weak appearance hides in reality tremendous strength. Now, that was the first part of 78. Then Lao Tzu goes into Well, everybody in the world knows, but nobody can put it into practice. Nobody applies what they know about water to life. And Lao Tzu, of course, is hoping that we will do it differently, that we will follow the lessons of water, whereas most of the world ignores those lessons. It's human nature to fight fire with fire, to present a tough appearance. But those who understand the Tao know it's better to do the opposite. It's better to quench fire with water. It's better to present a gentle appearance. And we have many examples to talk about why that is true. And previously, still in the recap, we talked about how it would apply for the ruler in ancient times and how it would apply to you in modern times. So the wise ruler would use the soft approach, like water, to deal with negativity. And this includes handling humiliation of the state, like a defeat in battle. And the idea is to be responsible and accountable in order to rally everyone. Then rebuild the strength of the kingdom in order to emerge stronger than before. Apply that to life. It just means that, well, we're all going to encounter humiliating setbacks from time to time. So this is the humiliation that we go through, that we suffer in life. And the idea is to acknowledge, to accept. If you refuse or deny, it won't do anyone any good, least of all yourself. And then by accepting, by knowing that, hey, this is my responsibility, I am responsible for the mistakes that I made. But now I have learned from them. I accept the blame. Now we can move on. And we and the people in our lives, we can fix the problems together. So that is the recap for what we talked about previously. Let's go into the next line in Tao Te Ching chapter 78, continue our discussion there. And we are approaching what I consider to be the most important and most life-changing part of the Tao Te Ching. For those people who are willing to dig for that spiritual truth, you're going to find it very transformative and powerful, as I have. Let's talk about line 10. Line 10 requires actually quite a bit of explanation that nowadays nobody is able to find in any of the publicly available works on the Tao Te Ching. Let me explain. So we've got 5 characters in line 10, and it's translated simply as "is called its master." And that is because there's a couple of cultural references here that are heavily dependent on ancient culture. Let me run through them with you. The first character is simply "is," so that's easy. And then the second one is easy too, "is called." So this can be translated as "it is called," "this is called," where "it" and "this" are implied. The third character is going to be a little more tricky for most translators because it actually means, in ancient times, the deity of the earth. So the ancients saw agency in nature, that there's some deity representing every aspect of nature. This is the same in East or West. So the ancients in the West, for instance, may look at the moon and say there's a moon goddess, may look at the lightning and thunder and say there's a god for that. There's a thunder god. Every aspect of nature is associated with a deity. So the third character that you see there, that is associated with the earth, the deity for the earth. Then the fourth character there is the deity for harvest, bounty for harvest. Same as when we have like a deity for fertility, very common in ancient cultures. And a deity for bountiful harvest, very common east and west. The ancients definitely had that. Now, when you put the two together, earth deity and harvest deity, what does that mean? We'll get to that in just a moment. Then the last character is Lord or Master. So this is saying that this is the master of the earth deity plus the harvest deity. Literally speaking, if you were to break down the characters one by one, you will get that. But when you put those characters together, it actually do not mean specifically the two deities separately. When the two deities are put together in this expression, they represent the sovereign land of the kingdom. Earth deity, well, it makes sense. It's a piece of land. That land is associated with its own deity. What do we use the land for? We use it for harvesting crop. So the deity for harvest is in there. When you join the two together, you're saying the land or the kingdom. And therefore, this is really saying the one who can accept the humiliation of the state is called the master of the state, the master of the kingdom, the king, or the master of the land. The master of the deities equals the ruler of the land. I hope that makes sense. And one who is truly deserving to rule is accepting of humiliation. So you have to look at line 9 and line 10 together to get the full context. And this maps to the virtue of water naturally flowing to the low point. Why is that? Well, humiliation is the low point in the history of a kingdom. Someone who is humble is able to accept those low points, those incidents of humiliation. So this is what the sages understand about the working of the Tao, and therefore that understanding leads to their natural humility. They know that everything goes through ups and downs in life, and the sages themselves are no exception. The only difference is the way they handle that negativity. And if you were to reference back to water, if water is blocked in its flow, it finds a way around the obstacle. That's flexibility. And as we mentioned, there is tremendous strength in that. Let's continue on. This is becoming more and more profound as we dig deeper and deeper into this chapter. And there's a whole bunch of implications that when you understand them and incorporate them into your life, you're going to find them to be among the most powerful things that you will ever learn. Line 11 says, the one who accepts the misfortune of the state. Okay, so let's focus on misfortune. That's the last two characters there. 不祥. So remember, the X in the pinyin is actually SH. That's how it is supposed to sound. And if you were to break the characters down one by one, the first character just means no. The second character means auspicious. If it's not auspicious, the meaning then is that it is inauspicious, which means bad luck or misfortune. So these are the tough breaks that we get in life. This is not quite at the level of humiliation, more like a setback or a delay. But the difference between the humiliation And misfortune is that humiliation happens from time to time as you go through life. Misfortune is something that can be a pre-existing condition when you are at the very beginning. So that is why it's going to go on to say that if you are able to accept the misfortune, not just humiliation, but the cards that you are dealt, the beginning state, that's part of the misfortune as well. You may have some disadvantages when you start out. If you can accept that and still work with it, you are even more powerful than the king of a kingdom. You're going to be the king of the world. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. So let's talk about misfortune. It could be like a road bump as you're traveling, or it could be at the outset of the journey that you're facing ugly weather, as one example. Now, we're going to have a lot more to say about this. For now, let's focus on the entire line. The one who accepts the misfortune of the state, let's talk about what that means. It is specifically saying the ruler must accept and even expect the occasional misfortune, which can be humiliation, and apply that to today. It means we must accept and even expect not everything will go smoothly. I think you and I know that to be true from our everyday experience. We have all seen that sometimes, despite our best plans, despite our preparations, things can still go wrong. Things can still be less than ideal. It seems to be the nature of life. So that acceptance that not everything will go smoothly, based on that, we know to make preparations so that when misfortune occurs, it doesn't throw us off balance or off course. It means we can maintain composure, and because of the advanced preparations that we have made, we can have some contingencies ready to go. So we have a plan B, maybe even a plan C, plan D, etc. We have alternatives like water encountering an obstacle and then flowing around the obstacle. We have the flexibility of water, which is one of its hidden strengths. So I think that flows easily so far. I think that's easy to comprehend so far. Let's continue on. Then it says, line 12, becomes king of the world. So this is next level. In ancient China, there were times of strife and warfare when the land of ancient China was divided into multiple kingdoms. To rule one of the multiple kingdoms already means that you are an absolute ruler of that kingdom. What you say goes. When you map that to now, it would mean your life. The kingdom is your life. It is what you think about, what happens in your mind, what you do with yourself, how you manage your life. So remember, kingdom, your life. Now, what about the world? Now, to the ancient Chinese, the world they knew was all of ancient China, which could be united as one empire. They would call that the world. They were vaguely aware that there were other lands beyond the borders of ancient empire, but they usually thought of ancient China itself as the world. So by being the master of everything under the sun, it meant that they thought this would be the emperor who would unite all kingdoms. What happens when we map that into your life today? Well, your world isn't just yourself. It's not just what you do to manage your own stuff. It's not just what happens in your mind. Your world includes everybody else in it, everybody you interact with. All of your interactions in and out of your various circles, and by circles, I mean like social circles, your work, family, relatives, and so on. So to be the master of that is even greater than being the master of yourself. It's your life plus all of your interactions. Therefore, when we talk about acceptance of both humiliation, kingdom, misfortune, the world, acceptance of both signify overall mastery. Your life includes a lot more than just you. It includes everybody else in your world. So in this world of yours, no matter what happens, you can handle it and you can come back better and stronger. So I hope you can see the distinction between the two. Humiliation is only a subset of all the misfortune you can possibly encounter in life. Acceptance is to not wallow in defeat. It means learning and recovery. So now let's summarize what we have discussed so far in terms of matching everything together, having it all make sense as a chapter overall. This has implications to leadership, leadership in all spheres of life. At the state level, at the business level, at the personal level, family level, social level, everything. So I think this will be very helpful to get into and to explain in great detail. So first of all, let's focus on the issue of acceptance, accepting humiliation and misfortune. Question number one, let's make sure we understand how is this acceptance connected to water. And as a quick review, we talked about how nothing in the world is softer or weaker than water, but nothing is better at overcoming the hard and strong. Okay, well, again, how is that linked to the acceptance of humiliation and misfortune? Well, first of all, water is seen as soft and weak, but it's actually powerful. So we've reiterated the same point quite a few times. And then Lao Tzu makes the point. Everybody in the world knows this, but cannot put into practice. So then when we say that, when we talk about everybody in the world knows about water, but then cannot put it into practice, we're saying, well, there's awareness. Few people can apply it to life. Now, it is becoming a little bit clearer what the connection is because as we look around in life, we see that most people, so many people out there, the conventional thinking, they are pointing the blame as a default action. Don't we see that? Just by looking around, we see there's so much blaming when something goes wrong. Nobody wants to own up to anything. Everybody is pointing their fingers to somebody else, some other factor. Oh, it wasn't me. It was all because of so and so that caused the problem in the first place. I try to help, but that person did not follow the rules. And therefore, we can conclude positively, indeed, few people can apply the humility of water to life. So there's more. the reason why people point the blame at someone else or some other factor external to them is because they feel like admitting mistakes is perceived as weak, just like water is perceived as soft and weak. As we have seen, Lao Tzu provides the complete opposite insights. Lao Tzu wrote, "The one who accepts the humiliation of the state is called its master. The one who accepts the misfortune of the state becomes king of the world." So Lao Tzu is definitely not saying that by admitting mistakes, taking on responsibility, you would be weak. Lao Tzu is saying that you would be strong, a strong leader, a master, the king, because in reality, taking responsibility demonstrates courage and confidence. Therefore, you're not being seen as weak, even though the ignorance may perceive you that way. A leader that can be courageous and confident, that is the leader who exhibits strength, a hidden kind of strength, not visible to those who don't understand, but easily visible to those who understand the Tao, like water. So this is the connection between the second half of the chapter to the beginning of the chapter. So this can be applied in all aspects of life, as I mentioned, including business. As an exercise, let's go ahead and try to map it from the ancient rulers to a business leader in modern times. So you have seen that the ancient ruler, if that ruler was wise, would handle humiliation of the states, would be responsible for that, would rally the people together, would rebuild the strength of the kingdom to be stronger than ever. This is easy to map. The business leader may encounter a situation where the company is in crisis management, and the causes for the crisis are many possibilities. It could be a public relations crisis, image, reputational crisis. It could be a financial crisis. It could be competition driving down prices or costs going up. It could be any kind of crisis. The business leader, if that leader is wise, would take responsibility for that, would own up to the mistakes. Now, as we talk about it like this, that seems easy to understand. And yet, Lao Tzu says everybody knows, but cannot put it into practice. He's right. According to one particular study, widely quoted, as much as 76% of people in the workplace are not willing to assume responsibility for a problem. So that's just a little more than 3/4 of the workforce. And if the workers are that way, it applies to the managers as well. If you are part of management, trying to evade responsibility has even more serious consequences. But if you take on the responsibility, then you can create a plan. You can announce proactive steps to address the issue. Like, here's how we make sure that this current deplorable situation can never happen again. The outcome is that you regain the trust of employees and customers. Corresponding to ancient times, when the ruler is able to have the trust and love and support of the subjects, the people. So easy to map. Even though relatively few people do it, it is today the most accomplished people who understand this and who will put it into practice. So, conclusion. What Laozi is trying to say can be summarized into the following bullet points. No matter what happens in life, we are fully in control of our response to it. And this is why Laozi talks about humiliation and misfortune. Because we can respond to humiliation and misfortune in the best possible way, and that best possible way is not evasion. Just as a reminder, humiliation is something that can happen anywhere along the journey. It's pretty severe, and most people would point to humiliation as the worst possible thing that can happen, because not only is it a setback, but it's public. It is seen by others. It tarnishes one's image. Humiliating. How humiliating is that? And there are many people, perhaps ourselves included, who will do anything to avoid humiliation. Then the other category is misfortune. At first glance, misfortune doesn't seem to be as severe as something like humiliation, which is not only misfortune, but also public knowledge. Misfortune, however, is something that can happen even more often than humiliation. It could be some kind of negativity, and it may or may not be known by others. It can be present before and during the journey. This is why I say humiliation is a subset of misfortune. Not all misfortunes are humiliating. Some are setbacks or delays, and the severe ones are humiliating. But then, misfortune is at a higher level than humiliation. The one with the ability to frame the best response to them will ultimately win. This is true even if the negativity was 100% caused by others. Even when you have nothing to do with the problem, it was caused by somebody else, you can still frame the best possible response to them, whether it is humiliating or just a misfortune. It is therefore still your responsibility to frame the best response, to accept it and take action. And when you bring ability to frame response together, you can reverse the two, juxtapose the two, bring them together to get responsibility. This is not a new concept. This idea of total responsibility has been with us since ancient times, and it's been around, East and West. There's a long tradition of Western wisdom that talks about this. And in Western philosophy, everything is spelled out clearly. If you read the ancient works, you can't miss the point that's being made. Nevertheless, every generation in the Western world rediscovers this truth or this wisdom, this principle anew. Let me ask everyone a question. Why is that? If this is something that's been in the wisdom traditions of the world, East and West, And yet, every generation is discovering it as if it was for the first time. Well, the reason is because that which is provided to you, you tend to forget. That which is uncovered by you, you tend to retain. If I just give you something, you don't value it quite as much. You can disregard. It was given to you. You didn't have to do anything. You didn't have to work for it. You didn't have to earn it. But if you had to do the work to dig for that, to put it together, to uncover it, to discover it, then it is a treasure that you cherish. And this is a treasure of wisdom. Let me talk a little bit about the wisdom traditions in the philosophical aspects from the West. There's books written about this. There's a book called Radical Responsibility, and it derives from this concept. I'll just bring up two major philosophies in the West that talk about this. One is called existentialism. In existentialism, it talks about, number one, you are responsible for everything in your own experience, even when it is not your fault. Now, this is a revelation to people who encounter it for the first time, but it is a truth about life, and it's an amazing insight. And this starts with the idea that we're constantly making choices. We're constantly choosing. There's a necessity of choosing your perception, your actions. It's a massive load on us mentally. This is a constant responsibility we have to take on. It can be terrifying. It is the reason why a lot of times as human beings, we want to figure out ways to put this burden of responsibility on other people. And that's why we say, well, it's not my fault. Somebody else made me do it. Somebody else screwed up. I was just following the rules. I was just doing what I was told. It's not my fault. We just love to blame other people. That's the way it seems, because it seems to be human nature to blame, to cast blame. And we do it in a lot of different ways. Sometimes it's not that there's a problem, but that there's something that's not quite right. And we say things like, well, everybody else is doing it, so I should do it too. You see what's happening there is that you are assigning the responsibility to everybody else. Maybe you're not pointing at a specific person, there's no finger of accusation, but you're still shifting the responsibility elsewhere. It's more subtle. So this is called living in bad faith. That you are not being genuine, you're not being real or true to yourself. The opposite in existentialism is to say, well, it's the flip side. It's to say, well, I need to be conscious of my decisions and make the choices that I make based on the principles that I have worked out for myself, my values. You have to do this every single moment, and you also have to be aware that you're making choices in these moments. Be willfully, mindfully making those choices. This is the flip side, and it's living in authenticity. So I think it's easy to relate to this, to identify with this, because it's about figuring out about yourself, knowing yourself. What do I care about? What are my values? What am I willing to take a stand for? And Make that choice when the time comes. That is living in authenticity. And then lastly, in this philosophy, there's a distinction between being responsible and being at fault. This is a good point. It's a point that we're going to come back to, but let me explain what the fault fallacy is. People oftentimes assume that taking on responsibility is to take on fault. And philosophers will point out it's actually not the same thing. You can be responsible for something, it doesn't mean you are at fault. For instance, if you were involved in an auto accident and it was caused by the other driver who was driving drunk, so the drunk driver really has the responsibility and the fault, but you too have a responsibility. It's your responsibility to recover from your injuries, to get well. If you were hurt, you need to rehabilitate, you need to go through physical therapy. That's your responsibility. You may not be at fault, but you're responsible. So I hope that clarifies the distinction between the two. So just because you say I'm responsible, it doesn't mean you are admitting to being at fault. So that makes it easier to assume responsibility. The other major philosophy in the West that addresses this issue is Stoicism. And it's even at a level beyond what existentialism talks about. It begins by stating that we all have absolute responsibility, 100%, no matter what. This is a more extreme view. Indeed, there's a book by the title of Extreme Ownership that talks about aspects of this. Just like there's another book called Radical Responsibility that talks about the ideas that we just covered in existentialism. Let's talk about extreme ownership. Absolute responsibility means you are absolutely responsible for yourself mentally and physically. Mentally, it covers your thoughts, your beliefs, values, emotions, your internal self-talk, your perspectives about the outside world. These are all happening in your mind. You must take absolute responsibility for all of it because nobody but you can think those thoughts. That makes sense. You must also take responsibility absolutely for yourself physically. This means your actions and responses. What you do, what you say, how you respond. This is true because you are the only one who can order yourself to do or say something. You have absolute responsibility for that. Nobody else can say something for you or do something on your behalf. At the end of the day, it's down to you lifting your hand to get something done, to pick something up, to give something away, and so on. That's point number one. So it's even more extreme than what we have talked about. Point number two, complaints and criticisms. To be a true Stoic is to eliminate all the negativity associated with complaints, accusations, criticisms, condemnations, or scolding. When you say someone is Stoic, that is a person who does not complain. The reason why a Stoic would refrain from these things, would eliminate them completely, because there are distractions from the present moment. Right here, right now, rather than to complain about something, we could all be using the time and energy for something more constructive. Any energy that goes into a negative action, like complaining or criticizing, is energy wasted. will produce no useful results. So that's main point number 2. Main point number 3 is on the positive front. Choices and decisions. We pick and choose. We have options. We make decisions. We decide on this or that. We decide on a course of action, which way to travel, which path to take. So in Stoicism, these are pointed out as levers of power. You have total control over these levers. Think of them as metaphorical levers. These levers are right in front of you. They are within easy reach. But when you were blind, you did not see them. You did not realize that they've always been right there, right in front of you all this time. But with the illumination of philosophy, you can see them. All you have to do is to reach out with your hand, grab the levers, and press down on the levers. It could not be easier. So choices and decisions are the levers of power. Last point. Change and improvement. Why do we go through all this? Well, it's because acceptance of the above is what leads to the possibility of change. Inability to accept the above leads to the impossibility of change. Therefore, a Stoic will say, it's my fault. Admitting fault opens the door to improvements. It also earns you the respect from your peers and trust from the people you lead. That's Stoicism. There's been historical debates between the different schools of thought that I have just outlined for everyone. There's going to be people who say, well, it doesn't make sense to admit fault when it's not your fault, etc. We're about to elevate this to the next level by talking about the Tao. We've gone through the Western ideas. As I said, the Western concepts are spelled out very clearly. If you read the ancient books in Western traditions on philosophy, you can't miss it. It's right there. In the Eastern philosophy, it's different. It's even more extreme than the extreme version that I have just shared with you, if that is possible. And it is not spelled out. There isn't a one collected single place where you will see it spelled out step by step. All the pieces are out there, but you have to put them together yourself. So this goes back to what I said. That which is provided to you, you tend to forget. That which is uncovered by you, you tend to retain. This is my journey, you guys. In my journey, I've had some great teachers. The two teachers who have the most impact on me would be Grandmaster Cai and Grandmaster Ching. I've talked about these Tao masters before. All of my teachers had one thing in common. They all emphasized the importance of finding your own path. Why is it important to do that? Well, the path that you discover yourself goes with the second line. That which is uncovered by you, you tend to retain. A treasure that you had to dig for, you will cherish. So when the pieces of this puzzle are put together, it is even more absolute, more radical, more extreme than the Western version you have just heard. And it's even a little closer to the ultimate truth of existence, because it is the Tao. Let me start with that. Tao, and I use the yin and yang symbol to represent that, of course. Yin and yang, what does it show us? Well, among other things, it is showing us that nothing is absolutely pure. There's yin within yang, yang within yin. There's no 100% anything. Everything has a little bit of the complement. So there's the dot, there's the little dot. In a situation where it seems clear that it's all caused by someone else, the yin and yang symbol informs you that there's still a part that is your responsibility, however tiny it may be. Now, you can, for instance, talk about traffic. Nobody can do anything about the traffic. It's all about all the drivers together. So I'm not responsible for that. I'm not responsible for the traffic. Looking at the yin and yang symbol, if you meditate on this, you will come upon the realization, well, first of all, your car is one of the many on the road, so you're part of it already. And number two, you have agency. You always have the choice of hitting the road earlier to account for traffic and therefore not be late to your destination. Same with the weather. You're not in control of the weather, but you are in control of yourself, which means you can always pay attention to the weather forecast and you can always prepare for rain gear when it is necessary to do so, whether that's an umbrella or something else. So you always have a part in it, however little that may be. If the government has set financial policy with disastrous impact on your life, you may say, well, that's the government. I've got nothing to do with that. It's not my responsibility. Look at the yin and yang symbol. You're automatically pointing a finger at some external agency. But the dot in the yin and yang symbol is going to inform you, well, did you vote? Did you vote for the policy you wanted? It could represent a vote out of millions of votes. So that's a tiny part, but it's a part of the votes nevertheless. And if you did not vote, that's your responsibility there. It can also represent your voice prior to voting to speak up, to oppose a bad policy. Did you do that? It could be to perceive that there's going to be this bad thing coming and be ready for it. This goes to the second point in the Tao, equally important, and that's the small. What do I mean by that? There is specific reference, multiple references in the Tao Te Ching about paying attention to the small and before bad things happen, before manifestation. Specifically, in chapter 64 of the Tao Te Ching, it says, when it is peaceful, it is easy to maintain. When it shows no signs, it is easy to plan. When it is fragile, it is easy to break. When it is small, it is easy to scatter. Act on it when it has not yet begun. Treat it when it is not yet chaotic. So this is just saying, nip it in the bud. When the problem is still small, easily dealt with, take care of the problem. It is also saying, before something occurs, see it coming so you can prepare for that. That's exactly what it means when it says, when it shows no signs, it is easy to plan. If you did not see it coming, that's actually on you, because you've been given the ability to perceive and to reason, to anticipate, to predict. When the problem was small, but you didn't take any action, that's on you. So in both cases, you have responsibility. In the drunk driver scenario that resulted in a car accident, it could have been something that you thought about, and there could have been some things that was possible for you to do. You could have seen, for instance, the drunken driver coming from far away, that he was driving erratically, having trouble keeping to the lanes, and therefore you give that person a wide berth. That is to act on a problem before it is a problem. You could have already seen that, for instance, knowing from past patterns that every year after holiday festivities late at night, as people are returning from celebration, many of the drivers on the road are a little bit drunk or a lot drunk. And therefore, it is wise for you to take on the responsibility to come up with a different plan to avoid that scenario. Looking at the yin and yang symbol will help you see that. That's not all. There's also Zen. Zen is the fusion of Buddhist teachings and Tao teachings. It comes from the Tao tradition as much as it does from the teachings of Buddhism, the Dharma of Buddhism. And it makes an even more striking point. First of all, it is pointed out that we are all connected at a fundamental level. We have the illusion of separateness in this material world, but in reality, we are one fundamentally. We are individual molecules of water, but we are together in the infinite ocean of the Tao. We are the same ocean. What affects you affects me and everyone else. We can't get away from that. This is the reason why the sixth patriarch of the Zen tradition, Huineng, before he became the patriarch of that spiritual tradition, he showed up at the place belonging to his predecessor, the fifth patriarch. And the fifth patriarch looked at him and said, well, you're a barbarian from the south. What makes you think that you can become a monk like me from the northern parts? So in the ancient times, in the northern parts of China and the southern parts of China, people appear differently, just as they do today. In Europe, Northern Europeans tend to be taller, Southern Europeans tend to be shorter. Same thing in China. So there's definitely some bias in ancient China as well for the taller people of the north compared to the shorter people of the south. We generally only see people in the West. It's mostly the people from the southern parts that have become immigrants. So there's the misconception that they're all very short, but when in fact you're just seeing a small part, a small sample of the overall population. So the fifth patriarch said, well, you're a short little barbarian. How can you become a monk like us tall northerners? And Huineng responded, there may be physical difference between north and south, but in Buddha nature, there is no north and south. In Buddha nature, we are united as one. He was right. The fifth patriarch was only testing him and knew right away that this young man standing before him was wise and could have a grand future. But this is the truth in the Zen, that there's no separation when you come right down to the ultimate level of reality, the ultimate foundation of everything. That's point number one. Point number two is self-nature itself. This is where we really dropped the hammer on this philosophical question. In all the previous discussions that we had about taking on responsibility, whether it's radical responsibility, extreme responsibility, or absolute responsibility, you could always have someone who say, well, that doesn't make any sense, because what if you were born into a bad situation? Your Tao doesn't work because there's no way you could have seen it coming. You weren't born yet. There's no way you could have done anything about it when the problem was small. You weren't born yet. But here you are, born into a very negative, dysfunctional, maybe even abusive situation. How is that your responsibility? That doesn't make any sense. There is no dot in the yin and yang symbol in that particular context. And this is the most important thing, the most important point that I want to make with everyone today. The point is, no, this teaching holds even in the above case, the above scenario. Now, we've already talked about how our physical appearances may be different, our skin may be different complexion, but our essential nature, the self-nature, is one and the same. That's one huge part of the puzzle. Here's the next part. As the truth about who you are, your true self, your true nature, called self-nature in the Zen tradition, you are eternal. This is one of the insights that the sixth patriarch, Huineng, talked about as well, that as the truth of who you are not born or extinguished. You have always existed. The truth is, you are eternal. Right now, this lifetime, this is not your only existence. You have always existed. Furthermore, in the Zen tradition, in Buddhism, we speak of attaining enlightenment over multiple lifetimes. What that means is that in your repeated existence in the material plane, you're here to learn a series of lessons working toward enlightenment. It is not the work of a single lifetime, but over multiple lifetimes. Every time you manifest, you learn different lessons, and you yourself played a central role in determining what your lessons will be this time. Therefore, you cannot say, well, I was born into a bad situation, therefore I cannot be responsible for that. You had a hand in it, even though you have no recollection of determining that this was the lesson you needed to learn. You needed to come into this bad situation in order to master the lesson of absolute, complete, total, ultimate responsibility. The conclusion is inescapable. There is no getting away from the Tao of responsibility. You must learn. You must take control. You must take charge. This is why it is so powerful. It gives you all the power you need to make any changes you want. There are people out there who understand this intuitively. They may not have seen this kind of assemblage of the teachings put together in this way, but they know it. And that's how they're able to rise above their circumstances, despite extreme poverty, extreme negativity, extreme dysfunction, extreme abuse. No matter what it is, they can rise above. This is why I say misfortune is at a level above humiliation, because misfortune may be present even before you start on your journey. Now it all makes sense. we are now able to get to the very last line of the Tao Te Ching. Line 13 says, the truth seems like the opposite. And I think you have just heard a lot of the truth that I wanted to convey. The truth of the Tao often seems opposite to what people do. It seems sometimes opposite to what the students of philosophy will argue. For most people, well, as Lao Tzu points out, they know the power of softness, to be gentle, but they lash out in anger still. Oftentimes, it's because they refuse to accept setbacks. They don't know the power of total responsibility. That refusal makes it impossible for them to learn from experience, thus impossible to improve. This is why we all need to follow the Tao instead of people, rather than to do what they do and then assign responsibility to them. We take the reins and we decide what we do ourselves. So I'll summarize by saying that the Tao runs opposite to the destructive path many people follow. And let me depict that graphically. Here's people. They go through humiliation and misfortune because everybody does. No one is immune to this. They go through this in life. But what a lot of people do is that they deny, they refuse, they do not accept. Like, that didn't really happen. I didn't lose. I actually won. They are bound to repeat the same mistakes. We have all seen this. Indeed, they may try to do the same thing the same way, but apply greater force. Try even harder. Like, it didn't work out only because I didn't try hard enough, so I'm going to do it the same way. They fail harder. They encounter even more setbacks, even more humiliation and misfortune. That is the destructive path. Instead of following that, we want to follow the Tao. Same thing to start with. We also go through the possibility of humiliation and misfortune. No one is immune. It's just that we handle it in a different way. Acceptance, it means accepting full responsibility, whether it's misfortune or humiliation. We accept that it happened. We accept that we need to do things differently. We cannot go back to the past and change what has already occurred. We figure out how to improve. We anticipate next time. If something was to happen again, it's going to be different. We want to be flexible yet powerful. We want to approach like water. We want to have the hidden strength of water while exhibiting the surface flexibility of water to flow in a direction that makes sense. The result? Smooth sailing. The result is the ease and graceful living that is the hallmark of the Tao cultivator. So I hope you keep this graphic in mind as you go about your day in the weeks ahead, because I really think that this can potentially be life-changing if you were to think about it seriously and meditate upon it deeply. It's powerful stuff. Now, we are ready for the paraphrase of chapter 78. And once again, our purpose is to demonstrate our understanding of this chapter in our own words. Section 1 is all about water, about the softness of water, about water overcoming the hard and strong. So here is the paraphrase I would like to offer everybody. Water seems like the softest thing there is, and yet it excels in overcoming the hardest things. Nothing can stand against its power. It is the universal solvent, the most essential and irreplaceable element of all. Then let's get into the second section. This is about how everybody knows the truth when it comes to water, and yet people are not able to apply that understanding into lifelong practice. So here is the paraphrase I would like to offer for that. We often bear witness to its power as water crashes through and washes away, or corrodes and dissolves over time. We can see the soft overcoming the hard. So intellectually, we can understand it as a principle. Unfortunately, when it comes to applying that same principle to life, we usually fall short. Now let's bring it home with the final section about humiliation and misfortune. When we encounter humiliating setbacks, we tend to respond with some combination of disbelief, shame, and anger. Only a sage can emulate water, accept the situation, and deal with it effectively. Likewise, when we encounter misfortune, we tend to dwell on how unfair it is and rage against it. Only a sage can be like water, flow with the situation, and turn it around. It is softness, not aggression, that ultimately leads to triumph. This is often the opposite of what we expect. And folks, this is why we want to emulate the sages who emulate water, which is symbolic of the Tao. Now, I think we are ready to wrap everything up with the full circle for Tao Te Ching, chapter 78. In the last lines of 78, Lao Tzu says the truth seems like the opposite. We link this back to the beginning, and we see water described as the softest and weakest in the world. So the truth is actually that water is strong. Water is actually the most powerful element of all. And this is why this is a reinforcing wisdom. It talks about why we should remind ourselves to emulate water as part of our cultivational practice. So the weak overcomes the strong. The soft overcomes the hard. This is what we need to bear in mind. This concludes our discussion of chapter 78, and I think it'll be great for us to do a quick summary, as we usually do at the end of a meeting, and now at the end of the chapter as well. In part 1, this is the summary that we have gone through before. The takeaways from part 1 of chapter 78, number 1, is the quote from Bruce Lee. Bruce Lee said, "Be water, my friend. And it meant a couple of different things. You have seen the duality of water. Point number one, be formless and shapeless. Adapt to changing conditions. It depends on the condition you are facing. When that condition expands, you pull back. When that condition gets smaller, you expand. That's one part of the duality of water. The other part is the strength, is the power. You want to be flexible and flow, which is from being formless, and you also want to be powerful and have the ability to smash. To emulate water is to be both flexible and powerful at the same time. Number two, note the difference between knowing and doing. This is from the part in this chapter that talks about how everybody in the world knows about number one, that water is both flexible and powerful, and yet people are not able to apply what they know. Everybody knows better. People know better, but they still use a hard approach. And what I mean by that is they know it's better to be soft and gentle, but in adversity, they still resort to anger and rage. So our resolution, second bullet there, is to resolve not to fall into the same trap. Just because that's what most people do, it doesn't mean that's what we have to do. When people lose their temper, we want to be the one to maintain composure. That alone will make you, will make you head and shoulders above everybody else. When others become violent, you want to be the one to maintain peace. I would actually even add to that and say, if the overall situation becomes violent, you want to make sure that you don't participate in that you are able to get away if at all possible. The ideal in the Tao is that before the situation becomes violent, you want to have the presence of mind to recognize what's coming and then take proactive actions to diffuse it before it explodes. So bring about the peace before the peace is even close to being lost. So that was the summary, the takeaways for part one. Let's get into part two, what we have talked about today. It's all about being the sovereign ruler of your life. And the way that Lao Tzu describes it is that you want to be the king of the world, or the emperor of the United Kingdoms, of the kingdoms that's been united into the empire in ancient times. So what are the components here? Number one, accept the possibility of negative outcomes. We know that this is what life is like. We don't always get the results we want. Sometimes we do. Sometimes things go south. Things don't work out the way we planned. So we want to anticipate that it's always possible. Secondly, and this is the one that we spend the most time on, accept responsibility no matter what. And responsibility is the ability to frame the best possible response. Today, you have seen this point being expressed east and west. From the Western wisdom traditions, you have seen it expressed from the perspective of existentialism. You have heard about the distinction between taking responsibility and taking fault. Then you heard about Stoicism, where it's even more radical, more extreme than existentialism, in that straight up it says, I take full responsibility, the fault is mine. I made a mistake. This is very congruent with what we explore in the Eastern traditions. In the Tao, the yin and yang symbol is suggesting to us, no matter how much you think it's other people's faults, there is a part that you have played in the overall drama, however little it can be. Plus, we're connected to one another, and therefore, we are part of it. And not only that, the most radical, most extreme, the most absolute form is that even if you came into this life with many disadvantages, you're still responsible. You're responsible for figuring out a way out of that situation. You don't get to complain. That's not the lesson. The lesson you have to learn is to figure out how to turn it from a negative into a positive. Many people have done this. They are among the most accomplished of humanity. We can join their ranks. And lastly, be soft like water. We want to learn from setback. We want to learn from misfortune, from humiliation, and we want to be determined like water. We want to keep in mind that water always finds a way, no matter what. If it cannot flow this way, it will flow that way. If it cannot flow above, it will flow below. Water finds a way. Water is determined. That's part of its strength. That's part of its power. So overall, you're going to have the 4 points here. Accept the possibility of negativity. Accept responsibility for those. Be soft like water. Be determined like water. So I think that is going to be a fitting summary for what we have talked about today. Our meeting has come to an end, but the journey continues on. Let us all travel safely so we can meet again. Until next time, may the Tao fill you with peace and happiness.